being sworn into Congress. It won't be using the chairmanship of the once respected Intelligence Committee to distort the President's words in order to mislead the American people, and it certainly won't be using the most serious and solemn powers of Congress to overturn a legitimate national election for political expediency. No, Mr. Speaker, my fellow Republican colleagues and I won't be remembered in history for doing any of those things, because we know this is far too grave a matter for subversions such as these of our democratic republic. We should all be better than this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Mr.
Mr.
Nadler?
Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains on both sides?
Mr. Nadler, you're advised, sir, that you have 156 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has 157 minutes remaining. Divide that by 60.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Our country faces a great tragedy and moment of truth. We have witnessed the President of the United States abuse his public office for personal political gain and invite foreign governments to interfere in our elections, putting the integrity of a government of, for, and by the people at great risk. The evidence is overwhelming and clearly shows that President Trump will continue to abuse his office and obstruct Congress if left unchecked. The Intelligence Committee conducted a robust investigation into the President's misconduct. Members interviewed 12 witnesses in public hearings totaling over 30 hours, conducted 17 depositions totaling over 100 hours, examined text messages and emails, reviewed the President's own words and actions, and published a 300-page report detailing their findings. All of this despite the fact that under the President's direction, 12
Vladimir Putin and his cronies waged a war on our elections with the goal of sowing discord and division in America. Do you think he's been successful? Somewhere in Russia right now, Putin is laughing at us today. The majority has given him exactly what he wants: a divided America with a pure partisan politics, with nasty political rhetoric at an all-time high. And some, already across the aisle, are discrediting the results of future elections. Already. It seems to many Americans that for the past 3 years, the House majority has been carrying out the wishes of the Kremlin. And the sad part is the Democrats have vowed to continue their sham investigations even after today's vote. Impeaching a duly elected president in a purely partisan manner with no crimes to show for it, not one element of a crime defined, disgraces the integrity of our democracy. Now is the time to end the partisan politics, come together and put America first. I urge this body to vote no to partisan impeachment.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Jeffries is recognized for 2 minutes.
George Washington, in his farewell address to the nation, counseled America that the Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. It is in that spirit that we proceed today. Donald Trump pressured a foreign government to target an American citizen for political gain and at the same time withheld without justification $391 million in military aid to a vulnerable Ukraine as part of a scheme to solicit foreign interference in an American election. That is unacceptable. That is unconscionable. That is unconstitutional. There are some who cynically argue that the impeachment of this president will further divide an already fractured union. But there is a difference between division and clarification. Slavery once divided the nation, but emancipators rose up to clarify that all men are created equally. Suffrage once divided the nation, but women rose up to clarify that all voices must be heard in our democracy. Jim Crow once divided the nation, but civil rights champions rose up to clarify that all are entitled to equal protection under the law. There is a difference between division and clarification. We will hold this president accountable for his stunning abuse of power. We will hold this president accountable for undermining our national security. We will hold this president accountable for corrupting our democracy. We will impeach Donald John Trump. We will clarify that in America, no one is above the law.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, nullifying a national election requires an overwhelming case of high crimes supported by indisputable evidence that the vast majority of the nation finds compelling. Now, Article 1 is a made-up crime called abuse of office. It does not charge that the president broke any law, but that Congress doesn't like the way he lawfully discharged his constitutional duties. This would reduce the presidency to that of a minister serving at the pleasure of Congress, destroying the separation of powers at the heart of our Constitution. Article 2 is another made-up crime called obstruction of Congress. It means the president sought to defend his constitutional rights and those of his office. It removes the judiciary from our Constitution and places Congress alone in the position of defining the limits of its own powers relative to the president. Our Bill of Rights guarantees every American the right to confront their accuser, to call witnesses in their defense, to be protected from hearsay, and to defend these rights in court. The Democrats have trampled them all in their stampede to impeach. Even in this kangaroo court, the Democrats' hand-picked witnesses provided no first-hand knowledge the president leaked aid to action. In fact, 2 witnesses provided first-hand knowledge that he specifically ordered no quid pro quo. Any case that charged no actual crime and offered no legally admissible evidence would be laughed out of court in a heartbeat. That's the case before us today. It would redefine the grounds for impeachment in such a way that assures that it will become a constant presence in our national life. Now we know just how reckless is the Democrats' chant of resist by any means necessary. This is a stunning abuse of power and a shameless travesty of justice that will stain the reputations of those responsible for generations to come. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, abuse of power was no vague or weak notion to the framers. It had a very specific meaning: the use of official power to obtain an improper personal benefit while ignoring or injuring the national interest. President Trump has abused his office and must be removed. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, from our founding, the United States has been a special nation, a city upon a hill. Our values are enshrined in our Constitution: liberty, equality, and opportunity. We are a self-governing people where every person is equal before the law. In the United States, we don't have a king. We choose our leaders. We vote. Generations of Americans have fought, and some have died, to secure these inalienable rights. The Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States." That's us. It's not we, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, or China, or we, the Democrats, or we, the Republicans. It's we, the people of the United States, and all Americans, and only Americans, get to have a say in our elections. Donald Trump used the high power of the presidency to pressure a foreign nation to besmirch his perceived primary political opponent. He corrupted our elections and compromised our national security so that he could keep power. Not power for the people, power for himself. In 2016, candidate Trump called for foreign interference when he said, "Russia, if you are listening." In 2019, President Trump sought foreign interference when he needed a favor from Ukraine to intervene in the 2020 elections. President Trump attacked and is continuing threat to our system of free and fair elections. Like all of you, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. I urge my colleagues to abide by that oath and stand up to President Trump's abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I appeal to your patriotism and implore you to defend free and fair elections and preserve the Constitution. God save the United States of America. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman and all members are reminded to address their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that our election should be free and fair. I do believe that with all my heart, except it seems like in this case, this impeachment is based on the fact that the Speaker, who said in this month, or last month, it would be dangerous to leave it to the voters to determine if Mr. Trump stays in office. With that, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have descended into the belly of the beast. I have witnessed the terror within, and I rise committed to oppose the insidious forces which threaten our republic. America is being severely injured by this betrayal, by this unjust and weaponized impeachment brought upon us by the same socialists who threaten unborn life in the womb, who threaten First Amendment rights of conservatives, who threaten Second Amendment protections of every American patriot, and who have long ago determined that they would organize and conspire to overthrow President Trump. We don't face this horror because the Democrats have all of a sudden become constitutionalists. We're not being devoured from within because of some surreal assertion of the socialists' newfound love for the very flag that they trod upon. We face this horror because of this map. This is what the Democrats fear. They fear the true will of we, the people. They are deep establishment, D.C. They fear. They call this Republican map flyover country. They call us deplorables. They fear our faith. They fear our strength. They fear our unity. They fear our vote. And they fear our president. We will never surrender our nation to career establishment D.C. politicians and bureaucrats. Our republic shall survive this threat from within. American patriots shall prevail. Mr. Speaker, I yield.
The gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was not among those who supported impeachment before Ukraine, but I called for impeachment today because our president is, as we speak, abusing his power and placing himself above the law. President Trump's attempt to sabotage the 2020 election is a clear and present danger on our democracy. We, the people, know this, and more Americans support impeachment today than at any time since Richard Nixon's final weeks in office. We know that it's wrong to enlist the help of foreigners in interfering in our elections. We know it's wrong to cheat. And we know what's at stake. It's not just that our elections were attacked, our elections are under attack right now. The very day the Judiciary Committee voted out articles of impeachment, President Trump welcomed Rudy Giuliani back to the White House. President Trump is still at it. He's doubling down. He doesn't think he can win an election fair and square, so he's trying to cheat. To ignore these crimes is not just giving the president a pass, it's giving him a green light. Those who vote against impeachment are not just endorsing President Trump's past actions, but his future ones as well. If you think I exaggerate in warning that our elections can be undermined, I'd urge you to come down to Georgia, find a black man or woman of a certain age, and they'll tell you the danger is real. And they'll tell you of brave Americans, patriots willing to risk far more than a political career, who marched and struggled and sometimes died so that we could have fair and free elections. We're not asked to possess even a fraction of their courage. We're simply called upon today to do what's right. And I'm proud to vote yes on impeachment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm glad that my colleague, Madam Speaker, just mentioned Georgia, because since 2014, the actual voter participation among minorities, African-American female, African-American male, and Hispanic female, have risen double digits. I'm very proud of what Georgia's doing to get everybody to the poll. I'm glad he chose to highlight it. Unfortunately, he just highlighted it in the wrong way, and I will not yield. Madam Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Gentleman from Madam Speaker, back home, people refer to Capitol Hill as a bubble. They are right. It's as if we are completely detached from what's going on in communities across America. Many here don't hear or listen to what people are saying, and many here as well think they know better than the people we serve. Our communities are benefiting greatly from President Trump's agenda: a booming economy, secure border, better trade deals, and a stronger military. Unfortunately, inside the halls of Congress, Democrats' obsession with impeachment is all-consuming. Is this how Democrat leadership chooses to represent the people of America? By nullifying the results of the 2016 election, disregarding the will of the American people, and doing everything in their power to prevent the president and this Congress from doing the job we were elected to do? After 3 years of trying, months of unfair, politically motivated impeachment proceedings, Democrats have delivered 2 weak articles of impeachment. Abuse of power? Not according to the Ukraine. President Zelensky confirmed many times that there was no quid pro quo, no action taken, and significant military aid was delivered without anything in return. Of course, his words have been conveniently dismissed. Obstruction of Congress? Is this the new standard? If this is the new standard, then every president since Jimmy Carter and every president moving forward would and will be impeached. Let me be clear. It is an honor to serve in the United States House of Representatives, but today I am distraught. Today, Democrats will disregard the will of the American people and vote to impeach the duly elected President of the United States. What should be equally troubling is that this has eroded, if not wiped out, the trust the American people have in the 116th Congress.
Gentleman from New
I
York.
yield back.
I reserve.
Madam Speaker, President Trump said no quid pro quo only after the White House learned of the whistleblower complaint and after the Washington Post had published an article about the president's pressure campaign on Ukraine. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, this is a sad day in U.S. history when we have to vote on articles of impeachment because Donald Trump has abused the power of the office of the presidency in his attempt to cheat his way to re-election. The facts are uncontested. Fact 1. The president abused the power of his office by attempting to shake down the president of a country that has been our ally. Trump wanted President Zelensky of the Ukraine to make up dirt on Vice President Biden because he sees him as the biggest threat to his reelection. Fact 2, Trump wanted Zelensky to go before the press and announce an investigation of Biden, hoping the mere announcement would create doubt about Biden and strengthen Trump's hand in the 2020 election. Fact 3, Trump obstructed Congress by engaging in a cover-up. Trump has refused to comply with congressional subpoenas and has blocked current and past employees from testifying before congressional committees. Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and one of our central responsibilities is to provide oversight and investigation of the administration. The very checks and balances the framers built into the Constitution so no one branch would have unchecked power. The House of Representatives has no choice but to vote and pass articles of impeachment because President Trump has abused his power and obstructed the ability of Congress from performing our constitutional duty. The urgency to move forward with articles of impeachment is because there is no reason to believe President Trump won't continue to abuse the power of his office. No reason to believe he won't continue to put his foot on the scale of his reelection. And in fact, his attorney just returned from the Ukraine and in an article just released in the New Yorker magazine confesses to continuing the effort to interfere in the election. In many of our congressional districts, we worry about voter suppression and schemes that purge legitimate voters from participating in the election. Or we worry about Russian interference in our election. It is a sad day in America when we have to worry about the commander-in-chief interfering in the election in order to be reelected. Elections should be decided by the American people. I will vote for both articles of impeachment. It is my constitutional duty that fulfill my oath of office. No one is above the law.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman. Utah, Mr. Stewart.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I discovered something recently. It's shocking, I know, but it turns out that some people don't like President Trump. They think he's loud, they think he can be arrogant, they think sometimes he says bad words, and sometimes he's rude to people, and to their sensitive natures, they've been offended. I get that, I really do. But let's be clear, this vote, this day, has nothing to do with Ukraine. It has nothing to do with abuse of power. It has nothing to do with obstruction of Congress. This vote, this day, is about one thing and one thing only. They hate this president. They hate those of us who voted for him. They think we're stupid. They think we made a mistake. They think Hillary Clinton should be the president, and they want to fix that. That's what this vote is about. They want to take away my vote and throw it in the trash. They want to take away my president and delegitimize him so that he cannot be reelected. That's what this vote is about. And for those who think this started with this investigation, what nonsense. You've been trying to impeach this president since before he was sworn into office. Some of you introduced articles of impeachment before he was sworn into office. This isn't something you're approaching prayerfully and mournfully and sadly. Oh, the chaos, oh, the sadness. This is something you're gleeful about. And you've been trying to do it for 3 years. And it's very clear. You don't have to go back and Google very much to find out that is the absolute truth. I could give you pages of examples of things you have said for 3 years about this president. That's what this is about. And if you think if this impeachment is successful, the next president, I promise you, is going to be impeached. And the next president after that, if you set this bar as being impeachable, every president in our future will be impeached. It erodes our republic in ways that our founding fathers recognized. They got it right. High crimes and misdemeanors, other than that, settle it at the ballot box. I look forward to that day. Let the American people decide.
Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair. Gentleman from New York.
Reserve.
Madam Speaker, I would remind the gentleman that if President Trump is impeached and removed, the new president will be Mike Pence, not Hillary Clinton. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. McCarcel-Powell.
I'm sorry. The gentleman yields 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Gentleladies recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I did not have the privilege of being born into this country. My mother brought me from Ecuador looking for freedom and opportunity, but that's not my story alone. This is a story that I share with so many people that live in Florida's 26th district and all over the country. We've left and experienced corruption in our countries of birth where brutal dictatorships have choked their potential to benefit those in power. This president elected by the American people, has violated his oath of office and violated the rule of law. The evidence is overwhelming that he withheld military aid approved by Congress and leveraged a White House meeting to extract a political favor from a foreign government. The president actively sought foreign election interference to benefit himself. It is undeniable that he has abused his power and obstructed Congress. He presents a clear and present danger to our democracy. As an immigrant, I still get chills because I feel so fortunate to live in this extraordinary country. The genius of American democracy lies in our Constitution and the dedication to the rule of law. I want my children and all of our children to feel the same way when they grow up. However, if we sit idly by as cracks begin to appear in our democratic institutions, our children will be in the same situation like so many of us experienced when we left countries whose leaders destroyed democracy. We, in Congress, must abide by our oath to defend our Constitution. That is my duty as a member of this body. That is my duty as a mother. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to the articles of impeachment against President Trump. As Chairman Nadler must recall, exactly 21 years ago today, I spoke on this floor in opposition to the impeachment of President Clinton. And 21 years ago tomorrow, I voted against all 4 articles of impeachment against President Clinton. Today's articles of impeachment against President Trump are an assault on our Constitution and the American people. To impeach a president for a phone call for which no crime is charged, never mind a high crime, and asserting his constitutional prerogatives as president is a clear abuse of power by the Congress. It sets the dangerous precedent of weaponizing impeachment to undo the solemn decision of the American people. Madam Speaker, President Trump and I grew up in the same borough of New York City, and today I am proud to stand with President Trump and urge a no vote on these horrible acts of impeachment, these articles of impeachment. I yield back the balance of my time and strongly urge a no vote.
Gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, the President and members of Congress each take an oath to uphold the Constitution. When the President abuses his presidential power to upend the constitutional order, we have an obligation to live up to our oath of office. We've been presented with direct evidence about the President's actions. They threaten our national security and undermine the integrity of the next election. We now vote on articles of impeachment for abuse of power and contempt of Congress as a result of that evidence. I've worked on presidential impeachments as part of the Judiciary Committee twice before. This third time brings me no joy. President Nixon attempted to corrupt elections. His agents broke into the Democratic Party headquarters to get a leg up on the election, and then, just like President Trump, he tried to cover it up. Then he resigned. This is even worse. President Trump not only abused his power to help his reelection, he used a foreign government to do it. He used military aid provided to fight the Russians as leverage, solely to benefit his own political campaign. George Washington would be astonished, since he warned against the insidious wiles of foreign influence. The direct evidence is damning. The President hasn't offered any evidence to the contrary. These actions constitute grounds for presidential impeachment. What is before us is a serious abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. These abuses strike at the heart of our Constitution. The President's unconstitutional abuse of power, a high crime and misdemeanor, is ongoing. He totally refused to provide any information to Congress related to the impeachment inquiry. It's our responsibility to use the tool our founders gave us in the Constitution to preserve the constitutional order. We must impeach, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Madam Speaker, the Washington Post headlined a story immediately following President Trump taking the oath of office stating, "The campaign to impeach President Trump has begun." How accurate they were. Here we are almost 3 years later, and what we are witnessing today is unprecedented in American history. A very partisan-based impeachment with no facts that warrant it. This is an impeachment based on hearsay and speculation rooted in a deep-seated hatred for a man for whom many of my colleagues on the other side detest. Not all, but many. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that personal disdain is grounds for impeachment. At every turn, the claims made by my Democrat colleagues have turned out to be false. Early on, it was claimed there was evidence of Russian collusion. There was none. We were told the FBI didn't abuse the FISA process in its investigation of the Trump campaign. That, too, has now been proven completely false. Then, when the Russian collusion hoax collapsed, we were told that we would hear from a whistleblower that had details of a nefarious call between the president and the president of Ukraine. Then we find out they weren't even on the call, and we still don't even know who the whistleblower is. We were told there was clear evidence of a quid pro quo for personal gain. After reading the transcript, it is obvious that you have to make assumptions that wouldn't even stand up in traffic court to come to that conclusion. Instead, the indisputable facts of record destroy their case. And though they allege treason and bribery by the president, the articles we are considering today only make vague accusations of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, because they found no evidence of treason or bribery or anything else for that matter. Mr. Speaker, today is a very sad day for our republic.
Gentleman from New York.
The country is now divided.
Gentleman's recognized.
The country is now more divided than it ever has been in my lifetime. The truth has been trampled by this House of Representatives, and because of the abuses at the FBI and the Department of Justice, more Americans have an even dimmer view of very important American institutions. Thankfully, the lens of history will ensure that the truth is told and will endure.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, one specific concern of the framers was a president who would corrupt our elections, who would abuse the great powers of his office to ensure his own re-election. The impeachment inquiry is not an effort to overturn an election. It is a reaffirmation of the simple truth that in the United States of America, no person, not even the president, is above the law, and our democracy cannot allow a duly elected president to abuse the power of his office for personal and political gain. And I now yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I hate no woman or man. Today, the American people should receive clarity and truth. The Constitution is the highest law of the land. The President breached and violated the Constitution of the United States of America. The President committed constitutional crimes. The President's crimes are impeachable. John F. Kennedy said, if this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men by force or threat of force could defy the commands of our courts and Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors. The facts are undisputed. First, President Trump violated his oath of office by placing his personal political interests above the national interest by scheming to coerce Ukraine into investigating a potential election opponent. Second, President Trump betrayed the nation by withholding the congressionally agreed $391 million to a fragile ally against a very strong foe, Russia. Third, the essential purpose of the scheme concocted by the president was to enlist a foreign country to help in the 2020 election. These acts are constitutional crimes and abuse of power. The truth is, the president did ask for a favor. Those were his own words. In the July 25th call, no mention of corruption, only the mention of the Bidens. The president was engaged in wrongdoing and is a clear and present danger. He has a pattern and his behavior remains a continuing threat to America's national security. The truth is that abuse of power does violate the Constitution while both corrupting and cheating our American democracy. His acts betrayed the nation. He must take care to execute laws faithfully. This is the truth. Why does the truth matter? Because it matters to the farmer at his or her plow. It matters to the waitress on an early morning shift. It matters to the steel worker building America. It matters to the teacher in a 5th grade class. It matters to a mother kissing off her military recruit going off to war. The Constitution must be preserved. Our laws must be honored and respected. The bloodshed and sacrifice of fellow Americans cannot be ignored, trampled on, or rejected. And today, our actions on the vote taken today must be for no personal gain or grandeur. The bright light of this constitutional democracy has been dimmed because of his acts. The truth is no longer for all. It is for one man, Donald J. Trump. His truth, his way. We must reject that abuse of power because this is not America. No one is above the law. Alexander Hamilton said impeachment was designed to deal with the misconduct of public men and violation of public trust. The president has violated the trust. We must impeach
Who seeks recognition?
Donald J. Trump.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it's my pleasure to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mitchell.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Today, the House of Representatives votes on 2 articles of impeachment for President Trump. Members and all Americans must recognize that impeachment was intended to be a safety valve, rarely used, only when a president acts in such an immoral and blatantly unlawful manner as to threaten the very basis of our republic. As we cast votes on these articles, the future tone of this House and politics in this nation must be carefully considered. The issue is not whether we agree with or like the president's rhetoric, political tactics, use of Twitter, policy choices, or his political rallies. One of our founders, Alexander Hamilton, warned of the risks of impeachment becoming a solely partisan act in the Federalist Papers. This impeachment inquiry and these articles clearly do not heed that warning. These proceedings are weaponizing impeachment, making it another election tool. I've carefully examined the evidence presented throughout the inquiry, and contrary to some, considered our history, our founding documents, and our future. It is clear President Trump's actions, as described in these articles, do not constitute treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. You simply don't like him. I'll be voting no on these articles and will hope someday we return to serving the needs of the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, President Trump on January 20th, 2017 raised his hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Now we must preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution from him. Madam Speaker, I rise today not to disparage and embarrass the President of the United States, but to defend our precious democracy. I speak today not because I hate this president, but because I love this body, the people's house. I have heard Republicans say, why are we rushing to judgment? This is not a rush to judgment. It's a rush to justice, and we must not delay. Corruption is corrosive. It eats away like acid, and the longer we wait, the more time we allow for this president to do irreparable harm to our country and our democracy. Just last week, Rudy Giuliani was back at it in Ukraine. So please don't tell us to wait, because the corruption continues. There's a famous quote that says, politicians worry about the next election. Statesmen worry about the next generation. Today calls upon us to be statesmen and stateswomen, Democrat, Republican, and independent. Our election is under attack from within. So to my Republican colleagues, many of whom spend a lifetime trying to build a reputation of honesty and courage, I beg you, don't throw that away for President Trump. He doesn't deserve it, nor will he appreciate it past the next tweet or next week. My fear and my prediction is that his actions will continue. Madam Speaker, Donald Trump recently said, I can do anything I want. He also bragged that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Well, he's shooting holes in our Constitution on Pennsylvania Avenue. And our house, the people's house, must defend the Constitution from a domestic enemy to the rule of law, Donald Trump. Because I don't want generations to come to blame me for letting our democracy die, I therefore rise in favor of impeaching Donald Trump. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to this political charade that has tormented our country for nearly 3 years. If there was ever any doubt that this entire illegitimate investigation is 100% politically motivated, earlier this month, Speaker Pelosi actually admitted the impeachment process began 2.5 years ago. Let me say that again. The Speaker of the House said publicly that the Democrats have been trying to remove our president from office since the day he got elected, simply because it was not the outcome they wanted. Another of my Democrat colleagues publicly admitted in May that the driving force behind their actions was, and I quote, "If we don't impeach the president, he'll get reelected." This wasn't an investigation, Madam Speaker. This was a political crusade. In order to arrive at their Stalinistic, predetermined conclusion, House Democrats spent the last several months staging well-rehearsed hearings where the charges were drawn up by their own focus groups, Democrat donors served as witnesses, and Democrat staff served as judge and jury. Even with the odds so blatantly stacked against the president, Democrats still came up with absolutely nothing. A while ago, the Speaker spoke of the Pledge of Allegiance. The last phrase of the pledge is justice for all. Justice was not something afforded the president during the investigation. He was denied due process, something the Supreme Court said should be afforded in all congressional investigations. That makes this process illegal and illegitimate. What a shame. What a sham. With that, I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I didn't come to Congress to impeach the president. Even when he separated babies from their parents at the border, even when he took money from our troops to build his wall, no, I didn't call for impeachment, because I'm here to make a difference in the lives of my constituents. Yet here we are in the middle of a constitutional crisis. As a former judge, I took my responsibility seriously to weigh the evidence and determine if the president's actions were impeachable. Unfortunately, the evidence in the intelligence and judiciary reports leaves us with no choice but to impeach the president. So I stand on my oath that I have sworn to the Constitution and to the American people. And today, I urge my colleagues to stand by their oaths too. The framers of the Constitution included impeachment as a safeguard against a corrupt president whose misconduct could destroy the very foundations of our country. Donald J. Trump abused his power when he obstructed Congress and ordered government officials not to appear before us. Donald J. Trump corrupted our election when he asked a foreign government to interfere for his personal and political gain. Today, sadly, I ask my colleagues, will you put your party over our country, or will you help save our democracy and vote yes on the articles of impeachment before you? I urge you to vote yes. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do have an inquiry as to the time remaining for both sides.
Gentleman from Georgia has 2 hours, 22 and a half minutes. Gentleman from New York has 2 hours and 27 and a half minutes left.
Pulled ahead. Okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point, it is my, I yield now to a minute and a half to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
Gentleman's recognized for 90 or for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I start out first that this is the largest, most massive cover-up of such a list of crimes against our country, and it goes so far as to bring impeachment hearings to try to cover all of this up. And I would take you back to October of 2015 when Barack Obama said Hillary Clinton would never intend to jeopardize our national security. Again, the following April, the next month, Peter Strzok wrote the statement that was delivered by James Comey, and they spent Democrat money and Hillary Clinton money in Russia to pick up dirt on Donald Trump. And then Joe Biden goes to Ukraine and makes a statement, here's $1 billion, but you must do what I tell you to do. You're accusing Donald Trump of doing that which Joe Biden has confessed to doing. And by the way, Joe Biden was not the opponent of Donald Trump. He's in a 21-way primary for Democrats. He's running third in that race. His opponents are the other 20 Democrats. How would anybody dig into that mess of 21 people and decide he's going to go overseas and pull some maneuver like this? You have to assign him a motive. You assign him a motive, then you create the dots, then you go dot to dot. But the reality is that it was Biden that was doing the extortion of the power play in order to protect his own son. And it was Donald Trump that was following the law that said you have to ensure that there's not corruption here before this money is handed over. And by the way, there was a violent war going on in Ukraine, and that's when we sent blankets and MREs over there under Barack Obama. But when I hear this from the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, he doesn't think he can win the election fair and square, so he would cheat. And I've heard that here on this floor. No, it's the other way around. Your number one proponent of impeachment is Al Green of Texas, and he said those very same things, and they brought this case November 9th, the day after Trump was elected. I yield back.
I yield. Reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, words matter. We've heard many words over the course of these last weeks. Still, what strikes me are the words that are missing from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. A gaping hole in this conversation. The words they cannot or will not mouth. Defending a president's conduct. Conduct that threatens our constitutional order. And so, Speaker, I ask, when is it ever right for a president to coerce a foreign power to interfere in our elections? When is it ever right for a president to intimidate a foreign leader into announcing false investigations into a political rival? When is it ever right for that president to withhold congressionally appropriated aid to that country at the expense of its national security and our very own? And when is it ever right for a president to block a co-equal branch of government from investigating the scheme to cheat an election? The answer, of course, is never. But that word does not come trippingly from the tongues of those who are making the choice to stand behind a man whose behavior is not worthy of your tortured words. By our vote today, we are speaking to future presidents and to future generations. We are declaring that we will not tolerate foreign interference in our presidential elections. Americans alone will determine the outcome, and we will not permit a president to order the complete defiance of a co-equal branch of government. And in the end, regardless of the outcome of this impeachment, the president's tenure will end, and this body and our grandchildren will be left with what we did here today. Ours is a somber generational duty about love of country and lifting a Constitution to its gravest protections but its highest aspirations. Our democracy is a matter of conscience, and by voting to safeguard our Constitution, mine is clear. I thank you, Madam Speaker, and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I've reminded many times, we have fought on the sham process that we've had to deal with, and we fought on the facts and won both. And I will remind that if you want to talk about elections, remember it was the Speaker of the House that said we can't trust the voters it's too dangerous to leave it with the voters for President Trump next year. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As you all know, I serve on both the Judiciary Committee and Rules Committee, and I have literally spent hours poring over testimony, looking at documents, sitting in hearings. And you know the conclusion I got from all of that? This impeachment is a total joke and a total sham. And let me tell you one of the reasons why I think that. All of those witnesses, the 17 witnesses that the Democrats brought forward, not one single one of them was able to establish that President Trump committed bribery, treason, high crimes, or misdemeanors, which is required in the U.S. Constitution. And again, 17 out of 24 Democrat members on Judiciary Committee voted on this floor to move forward articles of impeachment before the phone call. And 5 out of 9 Rule Committee Democrat members did the same thing. So if the main part of your impeachment is the call, why did you vote for impeachment prior to the call? I also want to remind the American public and others that for 2 years, Adam Schiff claimed he had proof that President Trump had colluded with Russia. That turned out to be false. And then overnight, it was obstruction of justice, then quid pro quo, then bribery, then extortion. And the list goes on, but yet not one of those is listed in the articles of impeachment. To my Democrat colleagues, Madam Chair, I say, please stop tearing the country apart. Stop this sham. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
The gentlelady is correct. President Trump's behavior is not new. He has a pattern of engaging in misconduct and then obstructing any investigation into his misconduct to cover up his actions and hide the truth from the American people. I now yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Roybal Allard, for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Okay, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of today's impeachment proceedings and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, Madam Speaker. Our nation was founded on certain principles: that government should be of, by, and for the people, that a system of 3 co-equal branches of government would provide the checks and balances necessary to ensure the people's voices are heard, and that no one is above the law. Today, sadly, we are voting to impeach President Donald John Trump because he has fundamentally broken his covenant with the American people. In doing so, we are using the powers the Founding Fathers enshrined in the Constitution to address a president who has violated his oath of office. The evidence is clear and the facts are not in question. President Trump is consistently engaged in a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the rule of law. He has refused to take responsibility for his actions. He has undermined the checks and balances we rely on by obstructing Congress at every turn. And most importantly, he has abused his power by using his office to solicit foreign interference in our elections, undermining the will of the people. So on this sad day for our nation, I will do what the President has so often failed to do, and I will fulfill my oath to support and defend the Constitution, and I will vote in favor of impeachment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it is my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Chavez.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today is a sad day in our nation's history as House Democrats are poised to approve on a strictly party-line vote articles of impeachment based on what constitutional scholar Jonathan Turley called wafer-thin evidence. This will set a dangerous precedent where impeachment becomes the norm rather than the exception. That's not what our founding fathers intended. They wanted impeachment to be rare. They set a high bar for impeachment: treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. Alleged abuse of power, the first article, is not a high crime and misdemeanor. In fact, it's not even a crime. And since there is no concise legal definition of abuse of power, the majority party in the House can designate nearly any disagreement with the President from now on an impeachable offense. The second article, alleged obstruction of Congress, would produce a similarly dangerous precedent. Asserting executive privilege, a practice that began with George Washington, is not obstruction of Congress. Rather, it's a function of the essential checks and balances contemplated under the Constitution. Here's what nearly every grade school student in America knows, but apparently House Democrats do not. If Congress disagrees with the President, if they don't agree with the President, take it to court. Let the third branch of government decide. They're the refs. The House has never, I repeat, never approved either abuse of power or obstruction of Congress as an article of impeachment. But that's going to change today. Today, House Democrats are pursuing a wacky constitutional theory under which all 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore could have been impeached. If all of this sounds absurd, Madam Speaker, it's because it is absurd. In fact, this whole process is absurd and has been from the outset. But here's what's not absurd, but rather frightening. House Democrats today are setting a dangerous precedent under which no future president will be immune from impeachment, and that will forever negatively tarnish the history of this House. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, the President's conduct constituted the highest of high crimes against our country. An offense does not have to violate a criminal statute to be impeachable. That was confirmed in President Nixon's case and again in President Clinton's. There is no higher crime than for the President to use the power of his office to corrupt our elections. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This July, President Trump blocked $400 million in congressionally approved aid that Ukraine desperately needed to defend itself against Russia, because he needed Ukraine to do him a favor first. He asked the president of Ukraine to launch a public investigation into a political rival. Military aid and other benefits would only come after. But this is not about a single call or a single transcript. This is about a perfect storm, months of activity directly ordered by the president to his senior cabinet and political appointees, an orchestrated plan demanding a foreign power interfere in our democracy. President Trump betrayed his oath of office. He abused the power of his office for personal and political gain and has refused to cooperate with a co-equal branch of government. This is a vote for our Constitution, setting the precedent for all future presidents, Democrat or Republican. Donald Trump must be held accountable for his actions. Today we send a clear signal to this president and all future presidents: no one is above the law. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I rise today in opposition to the impeachment of the legitimately elected President of the United States. Enough. Madam Speaker, for the love of this country, enough. Enough of this impeachment circus. Enough of these sham witch hunts. I'm voting no because the President has done nothing wrong. The only thing the President Trump is guilty of is doing the things he said he would do. And if my Democrat colleagues were honest, they'd tell us the only thing President Trump is guilty of is not being Hillary Clinton. The only party guilty of obstruction, abuse of power, or whatever focus group term they're using today is the party on the other side of this aisle. They're obstructing the will of the American people. They're obstructing the very foundations of our country. By politically weaponizing impeachment, they have dangerously shattered precedent and abused our Constitution. They alone will bear this responsibility. Madam Speaker, they'll fail. And it's no wonder the American people don't trust this body. It's past time to be done with this circus and get to the work that matters, like securing our borders and passing trade deals. I will vote no and encourage this body to move on from this heartbreaking, disgraceful day to things that actually matter. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the moment our founders anticipated in establishing the power of impeachment has arrived. The evidence is clear. President Trump abused his power by asking a vulnerable foreign leader to investigate both his political rival and a baseless Russian conspiracy theory, while withholding congressionally appropriated defense aid and a coveted White House visit. He then blocked congressional investigation into these abuses. These abuses threaten the integrity of our elections, they corrupt our diplomacy, and they undermine national security. We sometimes regard constitutional checks and balances as the indestructible underpinnings of our democracy. In fact, they're not fixed. They're not indestructible. The President has demonstrated this beyond all doubt. It's up to the Congress, the first branch of government, to apply the remedy that the Constitution prescribes, because the threats to our democracy are real and present. With this vote, we affirm that no one, including the President, is above the law.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Since the beginning of this impeachment inquiry, it's been extremely troubling to see the partisan, divisive way in which Democrats have carried out this entire process. I guess we shouldn't be surprised, though. They promised they'd unseat this president since the day he took his oath of office. From the start, this has been a baseless attempt to undo the will of 63 million Americans who voted for President Trump. I can tell you, the people I represent in Kentucky, the very people who voted for this president to enact change and fight for this country, are appalled at the charade they've seen in the House in recent months. They are appalled at the actions from House Democrats who have failed to even come close to proving their case. I hope all of my congressional colleagues carefully consider the precedent they are setting by voting in favor of this sham process and these illegitimate articles of impeachment. These articles were written and built on a report that was drafted with biased presumptions, cherry-picked witnesses, and vastly disputed facts. The president did not commit any impeachable offense, and it's clear for all of us to see through the now very well-known transcript. This rigged process sets a concerning precedent for impeachable offenses moving forward, and I wholeheartedly oppose these baseless articles of impeachment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Many have lamented that this effort is not bipartisan, but that's on my Republican colleagues. Republicans have not sought the truth. They have sought to avoid the truth. They have demeaned and insulted witnesses, patriots, warriors, career diplomats who have provided evidence against the president. No House Republican has joined us to demand the documents and witnesses that President Trump has refused to produce. And Senate Republican leaders this week have announced that President Trump himself can set the rules of his own trial, and there will be no fact witnesses. Republicans refuse to seek the truth and condemn the abuse of power, or to work with us to prevent this ongoing behavior in the future. And that's the tragedy of today's events. In our nation's history, thousands of Americans have gone into battle without reservation to fight for our republic, as they still do today. Many have been gravely injured, and some have made the ultimate sacrifice. But today, in contrast, for fear of losing an election, my colleagues will not speak up for the rule of law or against presidential abuse of power. Voters may give them a pass, but history will judge them harshly. I will vote for the articles of impeachment. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is my privilege now to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank my colleague from Georgia and friend, Mr. Collins. Madam Speaker, I rise today in opposition not only to these articles of impeachment, but in strong opposition to the process that has brought us to this point. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights are all about process. Our founders knew that a government without constraints could accuse anyone of any crime at any time, even without compelling evidence. That's why the Fifth and the 14th Amendments established a bedrock principle of innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But on November the 14th, Speaker Pelosi informed the press that the president should prove his innocence when she stated, "Mr. President, if you have anything that shows your innocence, then he should make that known." The Constitution also guarantees that the accused can call witnesses to testify on their behalf, but the Republicans and the president were continually denied that right throughout this process. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right of the defendant to face their accuser, but not only have the Democrats prohibited Republicans and the president from questioning the so-called whistleblower, his identity has been kept secret. Before you take this historic vote today, 1 week before Christmas, I want you to keep this in mind.
day for our country and for our democracy. The president has abused the powers of his office, betrayed the public trust, and undermined America's national security by pressuring a foreign government to interfere in our elections for his own political gain. In this moment in our history, the Constitution is clear. The remedy for such misconduct by a president is impeachment. I didn't come here to Congress to impeach a president of the United States, but sadly, the president's misconduct leaves us no choice but to follow the Constitution. I have two grandchildren. My granddaughter Caitlin is 8, and my grandson Colin is 4. Someday, a long time from now, they'll ask me about this day. They'll ask about the time a president put himself above the law. And they'll want to know what I did to stop him. And I will have an answer for them. Today, I vote to uphold the Constitution. I will vote to impeach Donald Trump. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is interesting that the president was supposedly given rights in the Judiciary Committee, but maybe who would he have asked questions of? 3 law school professors and a staff member? Not a lot of due process there. With this, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Madam Speaker, we're here today because House Democrats have spent upwards of $30 million in 3 years trying to overturn the 2016 election of President Trump and come up with nothing. Because of their radical left wing, Democrats are willing to make all future presidential elections invalid until judged worthy by the majority in the House of Representatives. The President of the United States does not serve at the pleasure of the House of Representatives. Perhaps the greatest denial of reality regarding President Trump is acknowledging that under his policies, things are actually going much better than they have in decades for working Americans. We are a democratic constitutional republic in which power flows from we the people to our president and elected officials. The Democrat majority thinks otherwise. They believe that they are entitled to rule us, even if they have to change the rules to invalidate the will and the votes of the people of America. And that is why the absence of a case does not matter in this charade of impeachment. I believe that the American people recognize and share my urgency about what is at stake here. Madam Speaker, you and your majority may decide today, but I have faith that the American people will decide otherwise next November. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Del Bene.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of this resolution. After carefully reviewing all of the evidence and the articles of impeachment before us, it is clear that President Trump abused the power of the presidency and obstructed Congress. I did not come to this conclusion lightly. Impeachment is an extremely serious matter, but no president can be allowed to pressure a foreign country for personal and political gain. No president is above the law. His behavior has jeopardized the integrity of our elections, put our national security at risk, and placed his personal interests above those of the American people. His obstruction has prevented the House from conducting its constitutional duty of oversight of the executive branch. By failing to uphold his oath of office, President Trump forces each of us, as members of the House of Representatives, to uphold ours. I urge my colleagues to do just that and defend our democracy. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Rickleman.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I oppose this impeachment effort and will vote no on the articles of impeachment. I represent the 5th District of Virginia, which is home to so many founding fathers whose visions shaped the great country we are living in today. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are not around to see what their creation has become, but I don't think they would be pleased to see Congress subverting the will of democracy by holding an impeachment vote because the majority party simply cannot accept the 2016 election. Instead of wasting the taxpayers' time and money on specious investigations, we could have passed legislation to address surprise medical billing, secure the border, address the opioid epidemic, reduce student debt, and solve a litany of other issues that Americans actually care about. Tomorrow, we might have a vote on the USMCA, which we should have passed months ago had it not been for the obstruction and delays from Democrats, delays that have made farmers in my district and other districts suffer. Votes like the one we will take today, the decisions that have led up to today's vote, the nature and entire process of this proceeding reeks of careerist bureaucrats and politicians that put politics over people. I was not elected to take political votes that attempt to overturn the will of the American people. I ran for office to serve my constituents. Let's remember, that's why we are here. Weaponizing emotion is not the way to serve the United States of America. And to my colleagues who do just that, I offer a quote Thomas Paine wrote in The Crisis. To argue with a person who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I would remind the gentleman that the House has passed over 400 bills, 275 bipartisan bills, driving down costs of health care and prescription drugs, raising wages, rebuilding infrastructure, taking on corruption and self-dealing in Washington. 80% of these bills are languishing on Senator McConnell's desk. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I thank the chairman for yielding. I wish to place on the record that members of Congress swear a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and today we fulfill our oath by defending liberty. The central figure testing America's resolve is not here in Washington today. Rather, the closeted villain sits in Moscow at the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin has coordinated murders, election hacking, propaganda, the entrapment of willing fools and greedy underlings who put their own selfish interests over liberty. Putin seeks to sow disarray and destabilize democracies and the NATO alliance. At Putin's direction, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine in 2014, and as Ukraine defends Europe's eastern flank, 14,000 people have been killed at Putin's hand, with over 2 million displaced. Rather than stand up to Putin, President Trump and his minions aided Putin, first in hastening Russian interference in our 2016 elections, and then more recently withholding vital military aid from Ukraine to coerce its interference in our 2020 elections for Mr. Trump's personal gain.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
Might I end by saying, onward liberty, vote for the articles of impeachment.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Madam Speaker, I rise in
Gentleman's
opposition
recognized.
to these baseless articles of impeachment and the unprecedented process that's been used in this effort to impeach the duly elected President of the United States. It is a mockery of American justice. In 1788, one of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, wrote in the Federalist Papers, "In many cases, impeachment will connect itself with the pre-existing factions. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparable strength of parties, majority and minority, than by real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." What does this mean? It means that the majority can exert its influence regardless of justice. In this statement, Hamilton warned us about the danger of mob rule. Democrats have a criminal and have been searching for a crime for 3 years. But this president has not committed a crime. As the leader of American foreign policy, the president has a constitutional obligation to root out corruption in countries to which we provide aid. This is not an abuse of power. It is his job. One of the articles is obstruction of Congress. The only thing that's been obstructed is this president's right to due process. I don't blame the president for refusing to fully participate in this guilty until proven innocent circus. This is not how our founding fathers framed American justice. This is a tragic day in our nation's history. We have individuals that hate this president more than they love this country. Our country needs prayer and not this destructive partisanship. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, the President's obstruction is unprecedented and categorical. President Trump claims that the House cannot investigate his misconduct outside of an impeachment inquiry. He defies lawful congressional subpoenas and then he sues to block third parties from complying with such subpoenas. Even as he pursues his own interests in court, his administration simultaneously argues that Congress is barred from obtaining judicial enforcement when executive branch officials disregarded subpoenas. So when can the President be held accountable for his wrongdoing? In his mind, never. The Constitution, however, disagrees. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, my words are my only remedy today. In spite of the upcoming D.C. statehood vote, we expect to be successful. The people of the District of Columbia have no vote on impeachment or on any other matter on this floor now. I spoke on this floor on the impeachment of President Clinton 20 years ago. Unlike the Clinton impeachment on perjury concerning an affair with an intern, Trump's impeachment turns on sabotage of national security to get himself reelected. Clinton repented. Trump insists that he did nothing wrong. That's a promise to continue his long pattern of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Impeachment is our only recourse. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Buck.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Georgia. Today, Democrats lower the bar for impeachment. Under the standard, a president can be impeached in the absence of a crime, without due process, and for asserting a legally, constitutionally recognized privilege. History shows Democrat presidents have abused power to undermine democracy and win elections, and yet they have not been impeached. President Franklin Roosevelt used the IRS to target his political opponents. His son later admitted FDR used, quote, the IRS as a weapon of political retribution. President John F. Kennedy used the FBI to wiretap and monitor political opponents, including congressional staff. He deported one of his mistresses to avoid scandal. President Lyndon Johnson spied on Goldwater's campaign, signing off on wiretapping his opponent and Goldwater's airplane and using a CIA spy to obtain advanced copies of Goldwater's strategies and speeches. President Barack Obama refused to provide documents to Congress related to Fast and Furious. His unconstitutional recess appointments were unanimously struck down by the Supreme Court. He used national security agencies to lie to the American people about Benghazi to win the 2012 election. He spied on reporters. Finally, it was the Obama administration that committed 17 serious violations before the FISA court to spy on Trump campaign associates. Despite these clear abuses of power by FDR, JFK, LBJ, and Obama, Republicans did not impeach. Why? Because the framers did not want a low bar for impeachment. They wanted Congress and the President to work out their differences. When I asked Professor Turley in a Judiciary Committee hearing if any president could avoid impeachment with this low standard, he said no. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I would remind the gentleman that President Obama provided thousands of pages of information to congressional requests that Attorney General Holder and others testified, unlike now. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, today is a solemn day in America, a day that none of us hoped for when we came to Congress. But the events of today are something that each of us swore that we were prepared to execute in defense of the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This is the oath that binds the men and women of the 116th Congress. As our democracy implores, we defend her. A clear and present threat to American democracy is what brings us here. The architect, a president who asked that a foreign nation interfere in our election. This was our founding fathers' greatest fear. I cast this solemn vote for the many individuals in my district who entrusted me to be their voice in Congress. They entrusted me to uphold our Constitution for them. I vote yes for Sarah in Chicago, Doug in Kankakee, Diane and Flossmoor. Yes, for Kathy and Moments, Catherine and Crete, and Jimmy and Park Forest. The facts are simple. The path forward is clear. Impeachment is not an option. It is an obligation because no one is above the law. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it is my privilege to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, another member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Eschenballer.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Ranking Member Collins. You know, in the Navy, we had a saying, bluff, bottom line up front. Well, I'll give you the bottom line. Democrats are terrified that President Trump is going to win re-election. They can't beat him on the merits. So the Democrats are caving to their far-left radical base, and they're using the thoughts and the feelings and the assumptions of some unnamed bureaucrats rather than relying on facts and law to impeach a duly elected president. Let me be clear. This is nothing more than a political hit job. You know, I've been on all sides of the courtroom. I was a prosecutor in the Navy. I was a defense attorney in the Navy. I was a district judge in my hometown. And let me tell you, as a lawyer, I would defend this case every day of the week. As a judge, I would dismiss this on day one for lack of merit. There's no prima facie case here. I'll tell you who I'd prosecute, though. I would prosecute Adam Schiff for abuse of power. Why? How about the fact that he used his position as chairman to leak phone records of Ranking Member Devin Nunes? How about the fact that he dumped over 8,000 pages of documents on Republicans less than 48 hours before a hearing? That is the abuse of power. And obstruction? I'd prosecute the Democrats for obstruction. How about the fact that Judiciary Democrats voted down my request to subpoena the whistleblower? How about the fact that Chairman Nadler refused every single Republican request for a fact witness? That is obstruction of Congress. So again, let me be clear. Today is nothing more than a political hit job. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, once again, I hear a lot of attacks on Democratic members of Congress, but not one single word of substantive defense of the President's conduct. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, each of us here took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, not the President and not our political party. Today, history will judge. Did we abide that oath? To extort a foreign country, to investigate your political opponent, is an unconstitutional abuse of power. To solicit foreign interference in an American election is an unconstitutional abuse of power. The need to protect against just such abuses prompted our founders to grant the sole power of impeachment to this House. The delicate balance of power that underpins our democracy is threatened when a president disregards the Constitution by obstructing Congress's power to cover up illegal behavior. In doing that, President Trump violated his oath. Today, we must put country over party, conscience over complicity. Today, we must assert no one's above the law. Today, we're summoned by history to do the right thing. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I know this is probably not true, but I think the speakers are not working on the majority side because I have talked about it. Many of our members have talked about the facts. Let's just go over them real quickly. No pressure, no conditionality, nothing was ever denied them when they got through. They actually got the money and they never did anything for it. We have talked about the facts. That's a distraction that doesn't need to happen. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I've heard numerous colleagues say they didn't run for Congress to impeach the president. Well, maybe not originally, but unfortunately from the moment proceedings began, after the 4th vote to launch an impeachment inquiry, today's vote was inevitable. Many of them campaigned on it. I love this country with a soldier's passion. I came here to defend freedom, not to deny due process to anyone. I came here to solve problems and change the broken status quo, not to distract or disrupt those like President Donald Trump who deliver on promises to put America back on the path of peace and prosperity that has made and kept our country free. For months now, Americans have heard speculation about the president's motives in Ukraine. Despite months of effort, dozens of hearings, and countless documents, Americans have not seen proof that the president committed a high crime or a misdemeanor. We have a republic if we can keep it. This is disgraceful, dishonest process. It's a discredit to this body and to our nation. I urge the House to drop these divisive articles of impeachment and get to work for the American people. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, how much time, would you tell me how much time both sides have left, please?
Gentleman from New York has 2 hours and 2 minutes. Gentleman from Georgia has 2 hours and 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the facts are clear. The President of the United States withheld $400 million in military aid to an ally of the United States and also held back a White House meeting to compel a foreign nation to investigate his political opponent. At the exact time the President was doing this, Ukraine was engaged in a battle for its very existence with one of America's adversaries, Russia.